At first I was a little apprehensive about reviewing something so far outside my comfort zone, but I'm really glad somebody requested Don't Look Now because I feel like I'm really broadening my horizons with this film. I'm not extremely familiar with the thriller horror genre, and it's nice to go back to a classic and also to see some European horror, which I'm entirely unfamiliar with. It's also nice to see some early work from Donald Sutherland, who, as acclaimed an actor as he is, I'm ashamed to say I haven't seen much beyond his role in the Buffy the Vampire Slayer movie, making this oddly the second Donald Sutherland movie I've reviewed, but likely the only one of the two Donald Sutherland was happy to be involved with. I was also excited to review this movie because it was available on Netflix, and that meant I didn't have to pay $20 for the DVD, which is apparently pretty rare. I usually open these reviews with a disclaimer suggesting you see the movie before you listen to me sink my teeth into it, but as this isn't the most well-known film around, at least here in America, I'm sure a lot of folks have never even heard of it. I certainly hadn't. And since, again, it's a little pricey if you don't have a Netflix account, I'm going to approach this one a little differently. I'm still going to provide my in-depth analysis of the movie, and therefore I'm going to have to spoil the ending. But I'm going to include more summary than usual. And with that, hop into my little boat and let's sail to Venice, the land of the morbid, the depressing, and the ultra-creepy. Anybody else vaguely reminded of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory? Don't Look Now is an aptly titled supernatural thriller about loss and grief in which a little girl, Christine, accidentally drowns in a pond, and her parents, John and Laura, eventually try to move on with their lives. It's more difficult for John, though, because he had a premonition of Christine's death and ran outside, only seconds too late to save her, though he won't admit that he has this sixth sense. John is an artist who restores old churches, and they temporarily move to Venice for a project he's commissioned to do there. In a restaurant, Laura meets two women, one of whom is blind and claims to be a psychic. She saw their deceased daughter, Christine, sitting between them at the table and assures Laura that she's happy in the afterlife and that they have no reason to be sad. She doesn't see John in a white suit with blood all over him. Laura returns to the table and faints. When she awakens later in the hospital, John notices that something about Laura has changed. She's more relaxed, happier, and convinced that she's made a connection with their daughter because the old woman was able to describe the red coat Christine was wearing when she died. So against her husband's wishes, she insists on seeing the two women again. They hold a seance, and the blind woman, Heather, has a horrifying vision. She says that Christine knows something horrible is going to happen to John if they stay in Venice, and that they must leave at once. When she tells John this, he's furious. They've been trying to get past what happened to Christine, and from the genuine affection they have for each other, and with the physical passion they've managed to rekindle, in, may I say, the most explicit sex scene I've ever seen that also manages to avoid any full frontal nudity, they seem to have all but managed it. And now, with the psychic and her communications from the dead, which John doesn't believe in, all of his sadness and guilt is bubbling back up to the surface. Laura sees her supernatural experience as real, good, and necessary, and thinks they should really take stock in Christine's warning. But John is skeptical and sees all of this as a dangerous hoax. Still, he loves and respects his wife, so he promises to take a couple of weeks off from his project as soon as he's able. We discover they also have another child they've left at home, a son who they learn when phoned by the administration of the school he goes to in London has been injured. John can't leave his project right then, so he puts his wife on a boat headed for the airport. 2 hours later, he sees Laura on another boat, a funeral boat, with the blind woman and her companion. So he begins to investigate, believing the women are not what they seem. He involves the police, and when John finally calls the school in London, his wife is there with the administrator. Completely baffled, he follows the only lead he has on the strange things he's been seeing, and that's a figure wearing red he keeps seeing as he's digging for the truth, who, of course, reminds him of his daughter. The B-plot through all of this is a murder mystery, kept far in the background, but present enough to lightly intrude on the main story periodically, as at one point, John sees the police fish a dead woman out of the water and is reminded of his daughter's death once again. When John finally catches up to the figure in red, it reveals itself as an old, haggard woman we've seen standing on street corners from earlier in the film. She murders John with a knife, and we discover that she was the serial killer. In the final scene, we see Laura standing on a funeral boat with the blind woman and her companion wearing the exact same garb and facial expression she had when John saw her earlier, and we realize that John, the non-believer, who himself was actually psychic, had a premonition of his own death, and that by investigating what he saw in his vision, he set the events in motion that led to his demise. If only he had listened to the blind woman and opened his mind to possibilities he must have known from his own experience experience were there, he might have lived. He didn't die because he tried too hard to move on, he died because in his intense denial of what was clearly in front of him, instead of listening to the spirit of his daughter, who really was speaking to him and trying to warn him of danger, he followed only what he could see with his eyes. This is a richly atmospheric movie that says as much or more visually as it does through dialogue. It doesn't rely on cheap scare tactics to involve its audience with what's going on, but rather works extremely hard to put us in John's shoes. We see what John sees, and because he has psychic abilities but refuses to acknowledge them, the unreliable narrator is expertly employed, as we can never fully trust what we see. Many scenes are interrupted by memories, often of Christine drowning, and they aren't just there for the benefit of the audience like a lesser film might do as a crutch to parallel something symbolically that we just saw 20 minutes earlier, as if the average person is too dense to pick up on the idea that if a man who saw his 6-year-old daughter drown picks up a wet, broken doll in Venice right next to the water, he's probably remembering his daughter. And frankly, if the average person really is that dense, then they should sit through a bunch of movies like this one, that give them a little credit and make them to do certain things on their own while they say, "I don't get it," a couple dozen times until it finally sinks in. Really good stories have more going on than what's obviously right in front of your face, so practice thinking, kids. Hey, that statement right there seems to even be the message of this movie. Don't be gullible, but remember you have more to rely on than just your eyes. I just caught that. I think I like this movie even more than I did now. It's a movie chock full of symbolism and subtext that's about a guy who doesn't want to allow himself to look past the obvious. Does this 40-year-old movie have anything to say to us today? Yes. Yes, it does. So anyway, John sees the figure in red around Venice several times throughout the film, before he finally chases it, and cleverly, it's hard to know when and if he really sees her, or if he's having premonitions of her, since he unknowingly predicts his own death when he sees his wife on the funeral boat. There are a lot of these inventive editing tricks, which the film was praised for at the time, that misdirect our attention so they make a movie that could have been really predictable that much harder to call. But more importantly, editing that puts us in the action with John. Everything feels very realistic. When John feels nervous, the camera does things so that I also feel nervous. Probably the most tense scene in the film is when John is restoring a mosaic in the church, standing on some scaffolding. This is just after he's put his wife on the boat for the airport, and before he thinks he sees her on the funeral boat. The scaffolding is pretty rickety, and the film cuts to a lot of different angles. Up close to the wall with John as he's working, far back so we can see how wobbly it is, and we know what's about to happen. We've just heard a warning, apparently from beyond the grave, that John is in terrible danger. We clench up, just waiting for the thing to fall. The scene is painfully long as we anticipate this. We're waiting for a rope to slip or a wooden beam to drop out from under him, and then the camera cuts to a plank just above him. It starts to slip. We thought we knew how it was going to happen, but now the scene is even more tense because we weren't expecting this. The plank drops and breaks through the mirror on the scaffolding. The whole thing comes apart. John has to grab a rope and hold on for dear life, and the whole time we're grimacing, wondering if he's really going to make it. Now, this is a movie, and we know it's still got some running time, so maybe we're not really expecting that this is where he's going to bite the dust, but still, it's a masterfully executed scene that knows just how to make its audience feel the way it wants us to feel. And the scene itself is a great use of misdirection, because when he survives, we have to wonder if that was the danger and if he just got lucky or if something else is coming. And using the order of scenes is also a great tool in misdirection. We just saw a nearly fatal accident right before John sees his wife on the funeral boat. A long, distracting, intense scene of a very real danger right before a supernatural premonition of an event that follows the incident that will really lead to John's death that Christine was warning him about. It's a movie with a lot of thoughtful ideas, but it also knows how to present them in a way that makes us feel like we're experiencing what John experiences the way he would experience it. That's a very difficult thing to pull off. You got a guy having psychic visions who doesn't believe in them, and the film has to keep us from realizing he's having them because it wants us to appreciate his flawed perspective. Good stuff. I was surprised to see a married couple after losing a child still liking each other and still passionately in love. So many films with these motifs go the other way, like the only way to convey grief with a couple after the death of a child is to have them no longer speaking, or constantly at each other's throats, sick to their stomachs being around each other, or divorced. What makes me care about John and Laura is that they have major character flaws, and of course, John's ultimately gets him killed, but that they actually try to rise against their pain and adversity. It's kind of impressive to me that in a movie this depressing, John loves his wife so much that he smiles at the very thought of her. There's a tenderness to him that makes his sadness more poignant and makes me root for him more. And again, though it's more blatant than I think it has to be, but more common and widely acceptable in European films than in American films, the deeply passionate sex is the prime example of how close these two people are to moving on. I don't think the movie is saying that they could ever fully get over the death of their child, of course, but they're figuring out how to live their lives, allowing themselves to be happy. And yet, they're also not totally there. Once again, interesting editing gives us a juxtaposition of sex with contemplative silence as the sex scene is woven together with shots of their morning routine the next morning. They're trying to live like a normal couple, trying to enjoy each other, trying to enjoy life, but they're also thinking about Christine. This is hard, but it's also worth working through. In short, they feel like a real couple. They don't get along all the time. They're different people, and those differences put them on opposite sides of arguments sometimes. Laura wants to communicate with Christine, and the film does a good job of making her reasonable in this desire. The psychic told her things she couldn't possibly know, and so there's a reason to believe that there's something to it. John may be ignoring some of the facts, but he didn't actually witness the old woman's claims like his wife did, and he's not altogether unreasonable either. Even if the woman really can speak to the dead, from his perspective, what's the point? Why drudge up all those bad memories when they're just getting their lives back together? John partially blames himself for what happened to Christine because he allowed her and her friend to play together near the pond. I would argue that the incident took a greater toll on him than it did his wife. We're made to appreciate both sides of this argument. I would even go as far as to say John isn't wrong to want to move on, even if Christine is speaking to them, but that his only mistake is in allowing his feelings to cloud what his mind is telling him about the dangers around him. When we finally learn that the old blind woman and her companion are truly innocent and really did think they were just helping, we realize that all John had to do was listen to Christine and leave Venice. There's no reason those bad feelings had to be trudged back up, no reason they couldn't continue moving on. Heather, the blind woman, says her gift is from God and not for people's entertainment. If there is a God, and both John and Laura are at best unsure about religion, then this warning is sanctioned by God and should be heeded. This isn't a Mulder and Scully story. It's not so much about the believer and the skeptic as it is about guilt. I think John has the right idea about how to live after the death of a child. You grieve and you always remember. It's always a part of you. But at some point, you learn to live your life and not to waste it. Because he allows his guilt to outweigh his common sense, that's precisely what John does. He wastes his life in the end. I would argue that his guilt keeps him from really moving on from Christine's death, even though he preaches that to his wife, as evidenced by how defensive and emotional he gets when Laura starts talking about that night, after she implores him to listen to Christine's warning. If he was as ready to put it behind him as he claims, he wouldn't have chased the serial killer with the red coat. He could have done what Christine asked and still moved on from the incident. Ironically, John says after Laura swears she's fine in the hospital, after she fainted, "Seeing is believing, and I believe you." At the end, when his own premonitions lead him to his death, we find that this statement isn't always true. He saw more than anyone, refused to believe, and that cost him his life. Now, I have to admit that the slow pace of the film, which is typical for this period in American films, and it seems to be that way too for European films, made me restless through most of the movie. When it was finished, I realized a whole lot had happened, both in plot and thematically. In a lot of scenes I thought really dragged just for the sake of realism at first. Every scene is doing something to progress the plot, develop characters, or add to the subtext, even if we don't realize it at first. It's definitely one of those movies worth watching twice. There's a lot of atmosphere here, and setting is as important in this movie as I've ever seen it. Venice is transformed from the beautiful, romantic city it's usually depicted as into a cold, ancient, bleak hell, where everywhere you turn you're reminded of your own mortality. It's a very religious city, and so you're reminded of death and the hope of earning God's favor to go to heaven, and it's surrounded by water, and you have to travel almost everywhere by boat. The worst place on earth for a couple who has lost a child by drowning. I like that the movie is smart enough not to just have John and Laura living here. Who in their right mind, after that horror, would move to a city where you're always surrounded by water, but rather having it be a temporary business trip? The characters are often very thoughtful, presenting ideas I hadn't considered before and giving me things to think about beyond the last scene's ironic reveal. Toward the end, there's a scene where Heather talks about how she likes Venice because it's so easy to get around. Being blind, she can always tell where she is because of how areas echo differently. But Wendy, her companion, doesn't like the city for precisely the same reason, the echo. She finds it too haunting. This factors into the idea of perspective and how two different people can see the exact thing entirely differently. We were asked to follow John's perspective through most of the movie, and so up until we realize his mistake, unless we somehow guess the surprise ending, we don't see John's psychic visions as visions, but as real, there in the moment, like he does. Yet Heather experiences the same kinds of visions and recognizes them for what they are, because she has a very different perspective. Finally, there's also a commentary throughout the film about the differences between men and women. There are a number of examples of how women are better communicators than men, like when the school administrator keeps tripping over his words when he tries to explain to John that his son has gotten hurt, and his wife takes the phone from him and explains the same thing. She's able to do this because she's more level-headed, better composed. John's gender definitely plays into how he reacts to his premonitions, and the film seems to say that had Laura gotten the visions, maybe she would have recognized them for what they were. She may have even understood them better from the beginning and would have been able to save Christine. After all, I got the idea from the opening scene that John's vision started well before his daughter was actually in danger of drowning. Communication is a two-way street, how we express ourselves and how we listen. The fact that women are generally better at this than men comes off more as an observation than a slight against the male gender, at least in my opinion. It isn't like John's a man, so he's too stupid to realize he can see the future. His guilt also has a lot to do with it, as I said, but gender is definitely a factor and not one that he realizes. The movie makes observations about the female gender, too, and the one I found most fascinating is the one explained by the police inspector when John is trying to find his wife. He says that while men become more distinguished with age, women become more indistinguishable. Older women, he says, look more alike. He goes as far as to say they coalesce. That's why some women are so obsessed with looking younger, because their perceived beauty, at least according to society, lessens as they age, and it's that beauty that makes them stand out. Now, a lot of stories have been written about how that can make women insane, and perhaps though we're not told this, that's what happens here. After all, it's an ancient-looking old lady killing younger women who turns out to be the serial killer. This is really a movie I wouldn't throw in for fun. Obviously, it's more of an artistic piece than an entertainment, but a really well-told story. It's very well acted and masterfully constructed. I enjoyed how thought-provoking it was, and unlike a lot of movies in the genre, it doesn't simply use the supernatural in a sensational way, but rather to explore real human emotions. It holds up, and I can't really find any fault with it, so I'm going to give Don't Look Now a 4 out of 4.